I was born on the Arkansas side of the Mississippi River in the Mississippi Delta, and then I was reared on the Mississippi side of the Mississippi River. And I grew up in a little cotton town out in the middle of the Mississippi Delta in a primarily, I might say primarily black world. That's probably not exactly correct, but a place in which there were always as many black people as there were white people, in schools that were overwhelmingly black for reasons we'll probably get into, and in a world which was profoundly racially charged in my childhood in ways that I didn't really understand at the time. And I didn't come to figure this out until a lot later, but clearly I was, from a very early age, even as a kid, sort of traumatized by the how screwed up everything clearly was in my immediate environment. Not in terms of my family life necessarily. I had a very normal, lower middle class, government workers, families, kind of life. But in this place, in this time, that for reasons that I didn't understand and events that I really wasn't even very focused on at the time, there was all this craziness and all this tension, and I was compelled to wonder about it and to ask a lot of questions about it, explore it in different ways. And it's true that I did start writing at an extremely early age, and then started hanging around the weekly newspaper in our town, the Leland Progress, because the town I grew up in was Leland, Mississippi. And so from the time I was 11 or 12, I was stopping in at the local newspaper with some frequency, and the editor of the paper then was a man named Jim Lacey, who's still alive today. And Mr. Lacey was a conservative fellow, but really the last of the classic small-town newspapermen. What was once one of the archetypal American characters out on the landscape of the country, but which now really does not exist. Though I think the internet age may actually bring that character back to life in a different sort of form. But Mr. Lacey was this man who had two weekly newspapers, one in the town that I lived in and one in an adjacent town, an even smaller, poorer farming community. And the one in the other town, he never wrote any controversial editorials. He wrote only about the weddings and the births and the church announcements and the good works of the town. And he had lots of advertising in that newspaper, and he made his living off of that paper. But he lived in my town, and the paper in our town, he spoke his actual feelings. And he was not a left-winger by any stretch of the imagination. He was not an integrationist by any means, but he was a person who really believed strongly that the Constitution mattered, and that Americans have to abide by the law, that community should be a stable place. And so when the late 60s came along, he began to write editorials that said that segregation had been declared to be wrong and illegal, and that was something that whites had to come to terms with. And so he became an excoriated figure because of that. In fact, years later, when I went back to do some research in the town, and I tried to find the back copies of the Leland Progress from that period of time, from the time that he bought the paper to the mid-70s, they were nowhere to be found. They were gone from the public library. I later figured out that the library board had specifically banned them from the library. And I eventually found another set of them in another place. But so Mr. Lacey was a tremendous influence on me as a straight-talking, sober-minded teller of the truth, who was willing to confront the consequences of what he had to say. And for him, they were quite severe. In the end, it became a sort of untenable operation. The Ku Klux Klan burned a cross in his front yard, and eventually. And he was from a fairly wealthy patrician family from another part of the state, and eventually he and his family moved back to what had been their hometown, and he took over the old family store, and in fact I think that's where he still is today.